to do the introduction, Kent, I'm going to throw it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about
Mm.
Stephen?
I can tell you stuff about Steve that he doesn't even want me to tell. And so I won't do that today. But here's what I will say is, my goodness, Stephen, we've known each other for a whole bunch of years. How's that?
12. We're number 12. Can you
Is
believe
it
it?
12 years? Wow. And Stephen has always been an inspiration to me in being gracious, thoughtful, and really strategic. In terms of communications and the way he looks at trends, sets trends, data, and helps shape data in the philanthropic space. Anyhow, Stephen, you can talk as much as you want to about your background, but we were fortunate about a year ago to have Stephen share the results of the first study of the state of capital campaigns. And the study is being repeated and will continue to be so.
Yep.
Stephen, we're grateful to have you as a guest, and want to welcome everybody. As you have thoughts, questions, feel free to put those in the chat box, and we'll monitor those as we go along. And the other thing that I'll mention is, as a wrap up, we like to do a lightning round and
Yeah.
just hear what is one takeaway. So this is really our litmus test for Stephen. You got to come up with a bunch of really good takeaways. I know we're going to. And with that, Aaron, anything else before we need to hand it off to Stephen?
I don't think so. Let's hand it over to Stephen.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks, Kent. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, Kent, when I met you, I had hair, but you still have all yours. I don't know how you achieved that, so that's good on
Well,
you. We should you
when
should
when I met you, my hair had color.
Well, okay, we're even. So yeah, this is super fun, and thanks to you guys for having me. And for you all, it's nice to see a full room. I know you're super busy, you've got a lot going on, so it means a lot that you took 47 minutes out of your schedule. And speaking of lightning round, I got to get through this quick. So I won't say too much about myself other than I work at Capital Campaign Pro. And that's the agency where we put this research out of. But I'm no stranger to kind of philanthropic research. That's kind of what I've been doing in the sector the last, 10, 15 years. I was involved with I played a very, very small role in the donor retention research that FEP puts out every year. And at Bloomerang, we were doing research as well into online giving and things like that. So very much at home here. And it's been fun over the last couple of years to put out this benchmark study into capital campaigns because there wasn't any sort of formal scientific research into capital campaigns. And like Kent said, this is our second year. So super happy to share the results with you. And if you attended this webinar last year, if you were familiar with last year's research, there were some interesting changes. So I'm going to kind of talk about what changed, what didn't, and kind of what matters there. But if you've never heard of Capital Campaign Pro, we specialize in capital campaigns, of course. So if that's something on your radar, maybe you might need help with, check us out. We've got a lot of free resources, even if you are not, um, gearing up for a campaign right now. I think we can still be friends because we've got a lot of free stuff on the website there, including this research. So let's talk about this research. So, like I said, this is our second year. Prior to this, there was no formal research into capital campaigns, and that's kind of why we did it, right? Because capital campaigns are a big deal, right? They can be scary. There's a lot of sort of myths and misconceptions around capital campaigns, and we kind of wanted to put those things to rest because, agencies like ours, you can talk about your client success rates all the time, but that's not the whole sector, right? And that can sort of be self-serving. But this research is really a nice broad swath of the sector at large and how they approach capital campaigns, what challenges and benefits they see. So those are the things that we're going to kind of unveil for you here over the next half hour or so. So how we conducted this research, every spring I sent out a survey, and we're recording this in March of 25. So we're getting close to the next survey. And I usually spend the summer kind of compiling the results and then put out the report in the fall. So this report that I'm going to share with you is the most recent data for sure. But if you download the full research, which I hope you will, you'll probably get asked to fill out that survey here in maybe a few weeks or a couple months. So I hope you do that. I want everyone to lend their voice to this. especially if you hear things that maybe weren't your experience, because I want to know your experience. I want a full picture of the whole sector. This year's data compiles capital campaign details from about 500 unique organizations here in the US and Canada. 2 years ago, the data set was around 250. We've doubled in 1 year. And my goal for this year, of course, is to hit 1,000, but I need your help. So fill out that survey if you see it. Most of these 500 are not our clients. I think there's maybe only 10 or 15 of our clients in the data set. So this is not like, just capital campaign pros people and, what happened to them is what we think should happen to everyone. This is really supposed to be, the overall sector. So I want to give a shout out to some of the partners we had. AFP helped out this year, which is a great help. Bloomerang, Aspen
The
Leadership
ice cream
Group,
truck,
Highwave.
ice cream
They
truck.
were really helpful in getting the word out, helping craft the survey. And you can download the full research on our website. It's just capitalcampaignpro.com/research. You don't actually need the dash 2024 to get there. And one thing that was cool this year, I'm looking at the room. I'm not sure if any of you are affiliated with a YMCA, but we did a special addendum that looks at just YMCAs out of the 500, and there were a pretty good chunk of them, enough to make their own report. So this is something else that I'd like to do going forward, is maybe have a social services specific one, animal welfare, higher ed. That's also a goal of this study as we go forward. But we do have a YMCA now. So if any of you are YMCA, check that out as well, because there's some interesting nuggets there. Okay, speaking of nuggets, so let's get into the details. So I don't have time to cover the entirety of everything we found in the study. So I'm just going to give you some of the most interesting and maybe actionable things. So number one is that most people were satisfied with their campaign. 96% of people who finished a campaign said that they were happy with the results, even if they did not raise 100% of their goal. We even had someone who only raised 75% of their goal say, you know what, we still consider that a success. So I share that up top because, like I said, capital campaigns can be scary, right? But most people who see them through are happy with the results. Small shops, and I'm defining small shops arbitrarily, admittedly, at $1 million or less in annual revenue. Those folks were just as successful, just as happy with the results. They raised less, their goals were smaller, but their success rates were not smaller. In fact, they outperformed large shops, everyone larger than them, in a number of categories, which I'll talk about here later on. So if you're listening in and you consider yourself a small shop, even if you're maybe a little bigger than $1 million, you can do it too. This is not a discipline of fundraising just for giant, large organizations. Annual funds. This was a big one. So I'd say the number one fear we encounter among people who are thinking about a capital campaign is what's going to happen to our annual fund. Most people think that it is a foregone conclusion that the annual fund is going to suffer just because they're doing a campaign. That is not the case. In fact, most people, not only does their annual fund stay the same, it actually increases a good chunk of the time. So capital campaigns can be powerful sort of catalyst for growing the annual fund, and not something that is just going to take away from it. So we'll talk about that in greater detail later on. And then most people did not, so to speak, take their foot off the gas in terms of headwinds, right? We have, since we've been doing this research study, there have been a lot of national and global headwinds, the pandemic, economic fears, the election. We asked people, did that affect you? And straight up, did you pause your campaign because of those things? And a vast majority of people said, no, we kept going, which made me happy because sometimes these things can derail campaigns. But if you have a clear case for support, if you have a clear need, and a supportive donor community, don't let anything stop you. Don't assume that because, times are tough, that it's a bad time to ask people. That is usually a real killer in terms of delaying a campaign. So we're going to dive into some of the details here. And like Aaron said, please interrupt me, ask questions. That won't bother me at all. And I think we're going to take questions at the end as well. So for the most part, strategic planning tends to be the catalyst for campaigns. You may undergo strategic planning and then come out of it saying, you know what, I think the next thing we need to do is a capital campaign. So we asked people, kind of what was the catalyst for their campaign. almost three-fourths of people said it was strategic planning. Other things were lesser, but were there. A new leadership, and they kind of wanted to put their stamp on things by doing something big and bold. A challenge gift sometimes generates a campaign. Organizational anniversaries, it's our 100th anniversary, it's our 50th anniversary. That can sort of be part of a campaign, but usually isn't sort of the main reason or the main case for support. So if any of you are, thinking about doing strategic planning or have that scheduled, you might want to prepare yourself mentally that a capital campaign could sort of be born out of that, because that's usually what happens. Probably won't surprise you that most capital campaigns sort of are centered around some sort of building project, expansion, renovations, new construction. But some other campaigns weave in things like endowment and new programs or program expansion. But for most people, there is some sort of construction project. And if that's not you, there are a lot of people who do just endowment campaigns, just programmatic campaigns. That's totally fine. The success rates weren't different in that case, but this is just kind of show you, what a typical campaign is raising money for. But something that is growing are sort of all-inclusive campaigns that wrap up a lot of different things. There's an endowment component, there is a new facility, and then with that, some sort of program expansion. So not a one-size-fits-all approach here, but usually does center around a building project of some kind. Okay, so that's sort of, the snapshot of a typical campaign in our sector. Let's talk about some of the finer details. Talked about success rates early on. Here is sort of the fine detail there. So I told you about the 96% rate there. We also asked people, how much of your goal did you end up raising? And the average amount was 106, so over 100% goal attainment, which is great to see. The highest was 156%, which I always joke, Kent, maybe you should have that person on the webinar. Although maybe the goal
Why
wasn't high
not?
enough.
There you go.
Yeah, maybe their feasibility study should have bumped that up a little. Never know the individual story there. The lowest was only 75%, but like I said, this organization that was 75% a goal, they said that they were happy. So maybe the goal was too high, right? Another reason to do a feasibility study perhaps is to get that goal really kind of crystallized. But I show this to kind of encourage people because capital campaigns can stall out and burn out for sure, but it seems like that most people who follow it all the way through do consider it to be successful. Average dollar raised, just kind of interesting points here, not super actionable, around 8 million. And under $1 million in revenue, they're getting on average about a 3x their annual fund through a campaign, which is great. So small shops can do it for sure. This doesn't have to be something that only the big organizations can do. But 2, 3, 4x the annual revenue definitely possible in a campaign. Let's talk about annual fund. So, when I posed this idea to the higher ups at Capital Campaign Pro, the number one question that they wanted to answer is what happens to the annual fund? Because in our client work, we typically don't see a lot of cannibalization, and I think most firms would say that as well. But it's a little different having four or 500 organizations also say the same thing that we didn't work with. So we asked people a couple questions about the annual fund. One is what happened to the annual fund during the campaign? So the 1 to 3 years where the campaigning is happening, what happened to the annual fund? Most people said that either increased or stayed the same. Only about 22% of people said that it decreased. So this is sort of our myth busted here, because like I said, this is the number one sort of fear that I encounter when I talk to people who are considering a campaign is, okay, it's gonna decrease. What should we do about that? And I say, well, not necessarily. It doesn't have to decrease. In fact, a big chunk of people see an increase. Now, there are ways to make this happen. This isn't going to happen automatically or by accident. One way people tend to see these results is having a comprehensive campaign, for example, where they are including annual fund in the solicitation. But there are a lot of sort of tactical things that you can do to sort of protect your annual fund while also hitting your campaign goal. And then we also ask people, hey, what happened after the campaign. So in the ensuing, 1 to 2 years after the campaign concluded, what happened to the annual fund there? Even less amount of decreased annual fund. Only about 13% of people said that it decreased in the ensuing years. And then a big chunk of people said that it either increased or they were doing a comprehensive campaign and it was included in the campaign goal. But again, not a foregone conclusion that this has to happen. It can happen, and you can see that it does happen indeed, but maybe those people simply it wasn't top of mind. They weren't sort of employing some tactical things to protect that campaign or to protect the annual fund. Andrea on our team, one of our co-founders, she's a big fan of what she calls the double ask when you are asking for an annual fund gift or a capital campaign gift, you mention the other just to make sure, hey, we have the annual fund that's keeping the lights on, but we also have this other distinct need. We got to put a new roof on. We got to introduce this new program. We've got an awesome opportunity. Would you be willing to give to both? Rather than, simply sending blanket solicitations, confuses the recipient. We could go on and on. This is its own topic for sure, and we've got a lot of resources on our website about this topic, but it can be mitigated is my number one point here for sure. All right, annual fund. Let's go into feasibility study. So this we asked a bunch of questions about feasibility study, but since this is our second year of doing the report, I kind of wanted to highlight something that we're noticing a shift. And Aaron and Kent and I were talking about this earlier. One question we asked is if you did a feasibility study, who interviewed your stakeholders, the participants in the study? Pretty almost down the middle split, one third, one third, one third of only organization employees doing the interviews, sort of a hybrid approach where maybe there's an employee and a consultant together. And then the final third is just the consultant. And this bottom third sort of piece of the pie, that's sort of been the traditional model, right? Over the last, several decades of doing studies is you send a consultant, they talk to your donors, and then they sort of give the report to you. But what is shifting is we're seeing a little bit of a shift away from this, a few percentage points every year towards either the hybrid or just the employees of the organization doing the interviews. So that's an interesting shift that we're seeing. For our part, this top model is how we do it at our agency. And there are a lot of good agencies certainly who do it the other two ways you're seeing on the screen here. But if I had been doing this research 20 years ago, for example, when I had hair before I met Kent, I think this one would have been really high, probably 80, 90%. It's changing.
Yeah.
So that's one thing we're sort of keeping an eye on there in terms of feasibility study for sure. Okay. So another interesting data point about feasibility studies. So we asked people, yes, no, did you do a study? And based on that answer, I looked at how they answered other questions. And one interesting question where there was sort of an interesting, difference or correlation in how they answered was we asked people, hey, what were some of the benefits of doing the campaign besides just the amount of money that you raised? Okay, you hit your goal, you're going to put that money to use. That was the main benefit. But what else happened? And we gave people sort of a menu of responses that they could just check off if it resonated with them. Things like, our major donor relationships are stronger. We feel like we're better at asking for larger gifts. There was a whole menu of things. And I compared people who did studies to people who didn't in this category. And one thing I noticed is that people who did a feasibility study were twice as likely to say that a major benefit of the campaign was an increase in staff effectiveness, better internal systems being sort of either established or developed, and critically, stronger major donor relationships. And all these things make sense to me because they are part and parcel to doing a study. You are ostensibly talking to major donors, and hopefully, if those conversations go well, those relationships are going to be stronger because of it, right? Because you're getting feedback from them, you're asking them for advice on maybe the project or the case for support. So of course, the relationships are going to strengthen because they're in the campaign, right? They sort of become stakeholders in what you're doing and the planning of it. And then if it's maybe your first campaign or maybe the first time that a staff member has participated in a study, yeah, they're going to feel like they got leveled up in terms of their skills. So there is sort of a professional development component to going through this process. So very interesting there. So, I'm obviously a big fan of feasibility studies, and I think in most cases it's appropriate. There are some cases where maybe it doesn't need to happen, but, few and far between. But if you're maybe on the fence, because it is technically an optional step, right? But there's some interesting data here that, hey, going through it can pay dividends besides just, the fact that you're going to get money from these people and hit your goal. And then the other thing I like to point out here is we asked people who said yes to whether or not they did a study, what happened to the goal. So again, in a study, you're testing the goal, right? Among other things, although that's kind of a primary, part of doing the study. Well, what happens? It's not quite an even third split, but it's pretty close. About a third of people say that actually we went through it and we needed to increase the goal because people could give more than we thought. About 21% said that actually we decreased the goal, right? We went from 10 million to 8 million or whatever it was. And then a little under half said there was no change at all, which good on them, right? They were right on. They tested 10 and they came out saying that we can do 10. Now, I show this because none of these are bad outcomes. These are all good outcomes. You either get a more realistic, you know, picture of the goal, or you were validating what you thought you could raise. So that's a good reason. That's a really good reason to do a study because you think about board confidence, for example. Gosh, can we really raise five? Can we do 10? It seems high. It seems low. Maybe we can do more. That's going to give everybody, especially the board, confidence in moving forward with the campaign at that goal amount. So, I'm pro study, of course, but these are some, maybe some data points you could share with your boss, your board, your staff, whatever, if maybe anyone is on the fence, because there are typically only good outcomes. Now, it's an extra step. It can be an extra expense and a lot of work, but one that will pay dividends for sure. Talked about this, most people did not pause because of the pandemic or the economic fears. These were my big questions in 23 when those were maybe a little bit more top of mind than they are now. This year we asked a simple question, hey, were those headwinds very sort of disruptive to your campaign? Did it negatively impact you? And a little
Hey,
over half
Stephen,
said no. Yeah, go ahead, Kent.
can I interrupt?
Yeah.
On the previous topic, somebody
Yeah.
raised a question. I think I'd love to hear your thoughts. What if you can't afford a feasibility study or a consultant? How do you respond to that?
Well, so one thing we say is, can you get a sort of a pre-campaign gift to cover the cost? So that's the one thing I would suggest because it is such a critical step, having the guidance and also having sort of the clear validation of what you're doing coming out of the study that, going sort of blind, that can actually be more costly than the cost of maybe hiring some help with these things. And take it with a grain of salt. You're hearing this from a guy that sells these services. But that's why I'm showing you this data because there is sort of empirical evidence that it does a lot of benefit. Now, you could probably do pretty well, spending a lot of time reading, blog posts and ebooks and research like this and attending webinars and get a pretty good sense of what you need to do. But to have that sort of steady guiding hand, like having a Kent or an Aaron by your side helping you with the campaign, that usually equates to something that will save you money, right? Rather than the campaign kind of going off the rails or the study being done in a weird way that is not accurate to what is actually feasible. But what we tell people is, is there a donor or two, maybe a board member who could put up that
Yeah,
initial investment, right? To get you started.
yeah.
And if not, that may be a signal that the organization as a whole is not ready for a campaign if they don't sort of have that sort of support there. That doesn't apply to everyone. That's not a universal, but
Mhm.
that's an observation I've made for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks for your kind comments also. But
Oh yeah.
that's a pressure point I think a lot of times I
Mhm.
encounter organizations that they're leading with the certainty of what they can't do. We can't afford this. And I would say there's no, if you don't need the services of a consultant, if you don't need the relationship building of a feasibility study, then don't do it.
Right.
But then expect, I would worry a whole lot less about the money that we're going to spend
Yeah.
as opposed to the income that we're going to forfeit.
Yes.
And I think that's oftentimes a factor that's overlooked in the equation.
Yeah, you said it way better than I did in just a short sentence. You nailed it exactly. It comes down to the benefits of it. Um, okay, speaking of benefits, so I alluded to this question when I talked about the feasibility study, but here's everyone's answer to this question, whether or not they did a study. So I show this because raising $10 million is great, and putting a new roof on your building that is leaking is great, but capital campaigns can be a catalyst for real organizational growth, especially if it's your first campaign. So 73% of people who finish their campaign, actually, this also includes people who are in a campaign, um, they cited a major benefit being strengthening donor relationships. And that makes sense because, a majority of the funds for the campaign or the goal are probably going to come from a smaller group of major donors, and having strong relationships is critical. But the process of them giving, if done correctly or if done well, can also strengthen those relationships, which again is going to have long tail benefits. The next campaign, legacy giving is a big outcome from capital campaigns years down the road, typically. Um, Talked about sort of leveling up the staff. Over half of organizations said that, hey, we've gotten better as an organization at asking for big gifts, right? And maybe that was their first time. It can be scary to sit on one-on-one and ask for six, seven figures, but going through the process, hey, that was scary, but we did it, and we can do it going forward. Other things, internal systems, this manifested in a number of different ways. Some people said, we got a new database product, or we invested in well screening for the first time, or we put policies, we documented policies for the first time. Like we developed a gift acceptance policy. It was a common one out of this one that we had never had as an organization. We started doing pledges. We had never done multi-year pledges before. Now we have those, and we can do that separate from a campaign. So lots of sort of fun leveling up happening there. I love this one. The board became more engaged in fundraising. Again, this can be a catalyst for board fundraising in a lot of ways. And then overall, the staff getting more effective. A little over a third of people said that. So again, this is, if somebody is on the fence in your organization about doing a campaign, these are some other benefits besides just the dollars raised. So when you combine this with the success rates, it almost looks a little enticing, right? Rather than scary to do one. Um, Small shops. We love small shops. Just some details here. And again, I'm arbitrarily defining small shops as 1 million annually or less. These people, we asked, is this your first campaign? Most of those small shops said yes, which makes sense, right? Their campaign goals and amount of dollars raised tended to be smaller, but they were just as successful. And here's something you don't hear very often on these webinars. These small shops outperformed larger organizations in a number of categories. They had higher rates, even higher rates than this, of major donor relationship building. I think it was above 80%, and more fundraising system improvement. And this makes sense to me because it's their first campaign. So it may be the first time they've really engaged major donors in this way. So of course relationships are going to strengthen because you're starting sort of at a lower bar, if maybe that's the right way to put it. And also if it's their first campaign, much more likely that, hey, we went out and got well screening tools. We put all these policies in place that we had never done before. So, for small shops, capital campaigns can be a way to really add some rocket fuel to
Mhm.
sort of your operations. But don't be afraid. Do not tell yourself, oh, we're small, we can't do a capital. We're too small for one. Not necessarily. If you have major donor support, if you've got a broad sort of foundation of individual giving, you can do it. Even if the goal is 500K or 1 million, that's okay. That's still a capital campaign to you. It all comes down to the amount of commas and zeros and the numbers. That's really the only difference in my opinion. Speaking of boards, so I'll be a little critical here. We're only at about two-thirds board giving towards a campaign. This should be 100. I mean, honestly, and there are some good excuses, right? But giving something, and I'm not saying that these board members need to give a huge amount of money. That actually does not happen and shouldn't happen. But board giving, if your organization struggles with board giving, a capital campaign is kind of a sneaky good excuse to introduce it. Like, hey, we want to do this campaign. It's our first campaign. We got to build this new pool for the kids or whatever. Can you as a board member contribute? And if they give to the capital campaign, they're also giving to the organization, which means not only do you have 100% campaign board giving, but you have 100% board giving, which is I think a decent goal. And I'm not talking about giant gifts. If someone gives $100, $20, they're still giving. You're still at 100%. That shows a good signal that they are engaged and buy into the campaign. Now, here's sort of maybe not the inverse of this, but perhaps another way of looking at it. I would say besides annual fund, the number two thing I hear from people is we don't have a wealthy board. Can we still do a campaign? They think that that is going to be a hindrance to them, and it should not be. Most campaigns only get about 15% of the goal raised from board members. It's a pretty small piece of the pie. I think there is sort of a misconception that a majority of the funds come from the board. Therefore, we need a wealthy board. I was talking to an organization, I think I told this story last year, but it happens every once in a while, even after that, somebody comes to me and says, we have a grassroots board, we have a board that is made up of people that are in the same demographic or look like the same kind of people we serve. And I say that's great. You don't necessarily need, wealth is
Yeah.
obviously nice, but it's kind of a nice to have, not a need to have. And that does not happen in the typical capital campaign. And this number stayed pretty steady from one year to the next. And I expect that it would stay right around 15% for as long as I'll be looking at this. So again, you do not need a super wealthy board to have a successful campaign. In fact, it might even be better if you don't, because if they are a sort of a community grassroots board, they're engaged, they can speak on your behalf, they want these things to happen, they have a vested interest, you're going to be in good shape there. But, if somebody obviously can make a big gift from the board, that's great too, especially if it can, jumpstart the campaign like we were talking about before. Those are all good, but it's not, prohibitive by any means. Um, Other interesting things, I kind of showed you the high level here as we wrap up, but campaigns are a catalyst for a lot of things, including board participation. So we ask people, how active is your board chair, for example, in non-campaign periods and then during the campaign? And you can see, these numbers sort of decrease because they increase towards the top level here. So again, a campaign can be a catalyst for getting not just any board member, but the board chair specifically a little bit more involved in fundraising. This was also true of the ED across the board, despite organizational size or type. So again, it can kind of be a launching pad. I'm running out of metaphors to describe a catalyst, but it can really kind of supercharge all operations at the organization. So we've got a free resource on just sort of the board role in a campaign because it's really critical. If the board doesn't buy in, that can be really tough to get the campaign going for sure. So just to kind of wrap up here before we get to questions, most campaigns are successful in terms of satisfaction, right? They may not hit 100%, although a lot do, a lot go over 100%, but most people are happy coming out of it. Annual fund, you know, kind of a myth that it can decrease, but it doesn't usually happen most of the time. Um, I'm saying doing a feasibility study is worth it because you get a clear goal. Those relationships are going to be strengthened, lots of other benefits there. So, don't skip it, and like Kent said, it is worth the investment. It's going to pay dividends, on the other end for sure. The fourth one I can't stress enough, you don't need a super wealthy board to have a successful campaign. That is not what's borne out in the data. Only about 15% of the dollars raised come from the board. And there's the mean and median you may have seen on that slide were closer to 10. And then, campaigns spur higher activity in lots of places, not just among the EDs and the board, but among organizational leadership, it definitely does. So there's lots of stuff I didn't cover in the webinar that is in the research. So download it. It's just capitalcampaignpro.com/research. There's a lot of good stuff in there that I didn't cover. How people use consultants, rates of types of campaigns, average lengths of the campaigns. There's a lot of sort of fine data in there. So check that out. And if you're a YMCA, we've also got that special YMCA report as well. So I think we have time for questions if there were any. I'm cool to hang out. We didn't hit 47 minutes, right? We stayed right on, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and we've got some more things to touch on. There's been a lot of back and forth in the chat room. The last question on there, Stephen, how soon is too soon to start another capital campaign?
Oh, so that is in the research. So there was sort of an average amount of time. It was usually around, 5 to 10 years between campaigns. But, I would say if you've got again, if it comes down to your case for support, if you've got a clear need, if you've got something that needs to be funded and you've got a base of supporters, I don't think you need to necessarily wait just for some arbitrary, amount of time to pass. There's a lot of talk about like donor fatigue. And if, your donors may get fatigued if you're not employing good stewardship. But if you're employing good donor stewardship, some organizations are always in campaigns. You think of higher ed or large healthcare systems. It seems like they're always in campaigns, and they don't worry about donor fatigue because they do a good job of saying, "Thank you for giving to our last
Yeah.
campaign. These are all the great things that we accomplished because of your support. Now we have a new pressing need, and you can be a part of that." And I'm not a great copywriter, but that's kind of the gist of it. Now, what happens is when it can go wrong is when it's like you just immediately start asking for gifts to the next one without storytelling, without thanking the
Yeah.
donor, without kind of bringing them in. That's when the space is an issue. But if you go a couple years and gosh, we've got this opportunity to expand our programs by you know building this new building or expanding in a new service area, and your donors want that to happen because they believe in your mission, why wait? But
Yeah.
thank them, bring them into the process through a study, do another study, make them feel like they are part of the process. They will be. You're not just, faking it. But I don't think you need to wait for some arbitrary 5 years, between a campaign because that's what most people do.
On the topic of timeline, Don Robin asked, what was the general timeline from the feasibility study to the public launch to completion?
Oh yeah, a couple years typically. So overall campaign length was about 3 years. And then if you think, well, we do the study first, that eats up maybe the first 6 to 9 months of a campaign. We're typically shooting to get to 80 or 70 to 80% of the goal raised before going public. And so, that process probably a year to 18 months between the study and hitting 70%, for example. And then you think to get to 3 years, you've got the pre-campaign planning and then the public phase on the other end. But the average campaign length was about 3.3 years, according to our research.
Okay.
So yeah.
Well, and Aaron, I know you've got a couple of other things. Do we have time for another question, or do we want to go to the lightning round? What's next?
Yeah, I'll do a couple announcements. If people have questions, why don't you drop them in the chat and that'll prompt. But we wanted just kind of with our audience just to put this out there. We're booked up on board retreats. The earliest we have open is May. So if you're thinking of maybe that summertime board retreat, please contact us now. And if you do it sooner than later, I think we could sneak in a little pre-retreat board review with Kent. So just want to put that out there. We also have the Asking Academy. We have one coming up in April and then another one in June. So again, thinking of summertime, it's probably not too soon to get started on making some preparation and plans if that's for you. And then I am going to highlight next month's webinar. I'll be talking about the working genius and how work gets done and how we can utilize that framework within our own organizations and boardroom. So there's just a few quick announcements. But if you have a question, drop it in the chat. And also, we want to hear from you. What was your top takeaway from today? There's been a lot of research done. Stephen didn't go through it all. Please download the entire PDF and look over that. But for you, what was the biggest takeaway for you? And feel free to either drop that in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, you can share that as well.
Well, I'll start off, Aaron. I always learn something from Stephen. Pardon me. And to me, I guess the number one theme that I took away from this is, in two words, Stephen, campaigns thrive. And I know we see that in our work, but it's great to see that affirmed and quantified. So to me, that's really motivating. Thanks for sharing that.
Well, motivation is my number one goal with this because there's a lot of reasons that people can delay a campaign, but usually it comes down to fear. So we want to kind of alleviate those fears.
Yeah. Hey, Stephen, unpack what you wrote to Don about the pledges, going towards the goal, being at that 80% before you go public. So I think that might be helpful for everyone as well.
Yeah. So we asked people. So one question that was in the research is, did your organization utilize multi-year pledges? And most said yes. So that's very common where, you may say, okay, you're going to give $1 million. You're going to break it up over $250,000 over the next 4 years. But, we do. And Kent, tell me if you disagree, but you would still say, okay, we got $1 million, right?
Oh yeah,
Even if
sure.
it wasn't, yeah. So that was sort of the question there from Don is, even if you don't have the cash in hand, can you still say that you've gotten to the goal? Because most people fulfill
Right.
their pledges, right?
Yeah, we're raising gifts and gift commitments.
Yeah, gift
You bet.
commitments. Yeah.
There were also a couple questions now and earlier about, hey, what's the cost of doing a feasibility study? Even from having a consultant, does the fee of the consultant go up if it's a bigger fundraising project, bigger capital campaign? I'll let Stephen and Kent speak to that.
I don't think the fee should go up. Do you think so? Yeah, it's
Ours
yeah.
doesn't, no.
No, it's
Yeah.
in general, tying fees to amount of dollars raised is not usually typical, and some would say it's unethical, right? But I usually see between 20 and 50K for a study, all in, and that includes the pre-campaign planning, compiling the report, presenting the report to the board for sure. So it is an investment, right? And a good benchmark, not necessarily on this research, but the one that's been floating around is, you're probably going to spend 10% of the campaign goal on all expenses, not just a consultant, not just a study, but events, marketing, collateral, donor recognition, all that stuff. So a lot of people will just kind of roll that 10% and, add it to the actual goal. Sometimes that's why you get weirder goal amounts, right? But that, the consultant piece can be 2 to 5% of that 10%, right? So it is an investment for sure, but I think Ken nailed it that, boy, to not do it can be really costly because if you go through thinking you've got a goal amount that hasn't been tested or confirmed, or you don't have a steady hand that has gone through a campaign before and can help you, kind of avoid pitfalls and mistakes, that can be hundreds, if not millions of dollars in money saved, right? But it is an investment. I won't sugarcoat it from that regard. But even small shops recognized, hey, we spend 100K to make $1 million. That math works out, right? And that can mean food for kids and shelter for people, and that's all good outcomes.
And Stephen, when you talked about the campaign not cannibalizing. I've never heard that word in this context. Not cannibalizing the annual budget.
Yeah.
Campaign expenses, you say, would be around 10%.
Yeah.
Are you having the campaign pay for those, or the annual budget
Yes.
pay for
No,
those?
the campaign pays for them. The annual fund may upfront start to get it started, but as the gifts come in, you can sort of pay back the annual fund if that's the right way to say it. Yeah.
Got it.
Well, my goodness, 47 minutes just flew past
Look at
us.
that. I love the
Uh,
47 minutes.
Steve,
Everyone should do, instead of hour-long meetings, 47-minute long meetings. Let's make that a thing.
why not? So, Aaron, anything else before we wrap up today?
No, there's some great takeaways in the chat. So, look at, the goal can be larger than the annual operating budget and not sabotage it. Some comments about general costs. I think the capital campaign, not, they don't cannibalize the annual fund, benefits far outweigh. Anyways, just great responses there. This is always super helpful, and we're getting that same feedback from the chat. So thank you so much, Stephen.
Yeah, it's fun. And download the research. I just dropped it in the chat. Because if you do look at the research, a salesperson won't call you. That's not why we do it, but you will get the survey. Don't have to fill it out, but I would love for you to, share your voice. Because if you were listening and like, dang, this was not my experience at all, I want to hear that because I want this to be as accurate as possible.
Absolutely. Well, again, big, huge thank you to you, Stephen. It's always fun to share the room with you. And people have your contact information.
Yeah.
Stephen can help. If we can help, please reach out. And Aaron, let's see, next month, is it the Genius?
Yep.
Working Genius?
Types of working genius.
Yeah.
And we're probably most everyone's on our email list, but I'm going to be giving away a few assessments to use live in the webinar. So if you've been curious about the 6 types of working genius, send me an email and let me know. And you can join us in the webinar as not just being a participant, but maybe help display to everyone else the assessment and how we can apply that to organizational health.
Excellent. Thanks so much. See you guys next month.